World Computing is an interesting company to talk about. They may not be the most widely recognized studio today, being that they were shut down all the way back in 2003, but the impact they had on the industry, as well as games as a whole, is nothing short of impressive. New World Computing's story starts with its founder, John Van Caneghem, who decided that he was going to create his own computer RPG all the way back in 1983, after being inspired by games like Ultima and Wizardry. The project took 3 years to finish and was a true passion project almost entirely done by John alone. And in 1986, the newly founded New World Computing released their first game, Might and Magic Book 1, The Secret of the Inner Sanctum. And for the industry, it came out of nowhere, quickly solidifying itself as one of the best RPGs on the market at the time. Might and Magic was a flagship series that really propelled New World Computing, and this became even more evident in 1995, when they released a spin-off game for the series called Heroes of Might and Magic: A Strategic Quest, which, as the name implies, is more of a strategy game instead of an RPG like the previous Might and Magic games. The first Heroes game also seemingly came out of nowhere for a lot of gamers. It was a huge critical and financial success that would eventually overtake the main Might and Magic series in popularity. But it didn't come out of nowhere, because 5 years before Heroes came out, New World Computing had their first attempt at creating a strategy game that embarked players on a quest to save a kingdom. And when you play it, you really see how it helped lay the foundation of Heroes of Might and Magic's addicting and successful gameplay. So today we're going to talk about and play King's Bounty, an often overlooked game that is frequently reduced to a footnote of the history of Heroes of Might and Magic, because it deserves more than that. With that being said, however, it is difficult to talk about King's Bounty without talking about Heroes of Might and Magic as well, as they are both pretty closely linked figuratively, and in one case quite literally, but I'll refrain from comparing them too closely in this video. King's Bounty is a turn-based strategy RPG developed and published by New World Computing in 1990, coming out between the years of Might and Magic 2 and 3. The studio was interested in branching out a little bit, and John was thinking of making a more strategy-focused game, as he was a huge fan of the genre. So he grabbed 4 of his staff members from New World Computing, and the 5 of them got together and created King's Bounty over the year 1990. I couldn't find an exact release date for King's Bounty, but digging through some archived old catalogues, I did find it listed here, coming out in Australia right at the end of the year, just in time for the Christmas season. A lot of reviews that were published in magazines also didn't come out until early 1991, so you can probably assume that most people didn't actually play King's Bounty until later that year. Regardless of when you play King's Bounty though, the first thing you're going to want to do is go through the manual. Something you should probably always do when you're playing older games like King's Bounty. I know I never did when I was younger. I only looked through it because of the game's anti-piracy system requires you to. God, I always forget how much I hate this protection system. I have to count each line and each word every time I launch the game just to play it. Always wondering if the page title counts as a line or not. The answer is yes, it does count, by the way. But besides that, I really wish I did pay more attention to the game's manual, because in King's Bounty's case, it's where you're going to get the bulk of the story for the game. The manual opens up with a 17-page short story detailing the events that lead up to the game. It kicks off with 2 grave robbers discovering an ancient tome, detailing a prophecy on how to vanquish the good King Maximus and take control of the 4 continents that he rules over. Maximus holds a legendary artifact called the Scepter of Order, which ties his life to the lands he rules over. And as long as he holds onto the scepter, no chaos will come to the 4 continents. However, King Maximus's life is also tied to the scepter itself, and if he loses the scepter, he will begin to slowly die, bringing the 4 continents to chaos and ruin as he withers away. The robbers give the tome to the main antagonist of the game, Arich Dragonbreath, a powerful dragon who wastes no time in planning attacks, rebellions, political subterfuge, and summoning a powerful demon to sit on Maximus's throne once he passes away. Arich eventually succeeds at stealing the scepter, and the continents begin to fall to chaos as Maximus slowly fades away from the living realm. It is at this moment that you, a hero who has just returned from conquesting evil, vow to raise an army and reclaim the scepter from Arich. King Maximus supports you by giving you a weekly gold commission to aid you, alongside allowing you to recruit his troops from the castle to fight in your army. As long as you pay him, of course. Arich fears that you might actually be able to go to his castle and defeat him, because heroes always seem to win in these kind of scenarios. So to stop you from getting the scepter and saving Maximus, he buries the scepter somewhere in the 4 continents. He rips up a map that leads to its location and hands a piece to each of his henchmen that played a significant role in the theft of the scepter. These henchmen all now reside in captured castles around the 4 continents, gifted to them for the part they played in aiding Arich. If you don't find the scepter in time, King Maximus will die regardless of if you take down Arich, so now you need to prioritize finding the scepter instead of going after the main antagonist. Well, the story is pretty basic, cheesy, and even kinda stupid. I like it. It fits the game, gives your character a good reason to go on their quest, and it actually details what every villain in the game did before you go hunt them down. This ranges from Murray the Miser, who opened the castle gates allowing enemies to enter, to the Mad Tsar Nikolai, who straight up just slices the throat of a kid and incinerates the body, leaving no trace of it. I mean, the kid did accidentally eavesdrop on the Tsar, but still, Jesus fucking Christ. But in the end, it's a good setup to what you're actually getting into in King's Bounty. Or even if you ignored it before you played the game and read it after doing a playthrough, it just fleshes out the world a bit more that you just ventured through. After the short story, the manual will tell you most of what you need to know about playing King's Bounty, but unfortunately it doesn't really go into detail about some of the game's finer mechanics that really dictate how you can play the game. But we'll get into that a bit later. Launching the game, you don't get any fancy intros or anything, just a list of the fine people who created this game. And after that, you're straight into picking one of 4 heroes to play, all with different strengths and weaknesses. Your choices here really just boil down to if you want to have a large army or if you want to be more effective at magic. I think the first choice that most people will consider is the Knight, and it's a classic first choice and a very strong pick with very few downsides. He starts out with the strongest units out of the 4, and he can also field the largest army in the game, but this comes at the cost of his magic abilities. He can still use magic, every hero can, but it's not going to be as effective as some of the other choices, so you really will be relying on having a large army to get you through the game. Unfortunately, in the early game, his weekly commission from the king isn't that high. It ends up improving a lot as he levels up, but his level progression is incredibly slow, so getting the goal to field and maintain an army throughout the mid-game can be pretty brutal as the Knight. On the other side of the characters that you can pick from, there is a Sorceress, who is pretty much the complete opposite of the Knight. She can't field a large army throughout the entirety of the game, and she also starts off with the weakest troops out of all your choices. But she makes up for that, with being the only hero that can use magic straight away without having to be taught it. And as you can probably guess, her magic capabilities are incredibly strong, so you'll have strong offensive combat options on top of some utility that's going to make your life a whole lot easier through the game. The Sorceress also levels up fairly quickly, unlike the Knight, so you won't be hanging out for those large power spikes for too long. She also starts with the highest commission in the game, making gold hardly an issue right at the start of your journey. Unfortunately, as she levels up, her commission does fall more in line with some of the other picks, so it ends up being quite weak by the end of it, but those magic capabilities really make up for it. The next choice you have is the Paladin, which falls between the Sorceress and the Knight, being a jack of all trades, but master of nothing. His starting army and leadership may be better than the Sorceress's, but not by much. His magic capabilities are stronger than the Knight's, but he still has to go learn how to use magic first, and he really is only slightly better than the Knight at magic, so it doesn't really seem like a good trade-off. He does start off with a lot of gold, but he has a low weekly commission like the Knight, and even when he levels up, it goes up at a pretty slow rate. And that being said, while he ranks up faster than the Knight, it's still damn slow, and you will really be hanging out for those last 2 promotions playing the Paladin. Finally though, you have the Barbarian, who just says fuck magic. We don't need it, we have an army. The Barbarian can still use magic if he goes out to learn it, but you won't be holding on to too many spells throughout the entirety of the game, and you won't be getting much spell power to make any of it effective anyway. But alongside the Knight, he can field the largest army in the game, so you don't need to be relying on your magic as much anyway. And while he might not start off with much gold in the purse, the weekly commission he gets from King Maximus is high, and as he ranks up it is the highest commission rate out of all of the heroes, so building up a large army that doesn't need magic to support it is even easier. To make things even better on that front, he levels up incredibly quickly, so you will hit that top promotion and be raking in that extra gold way earlier in the game than any of the other picks, making that massive army even easier to get early. Overall, each character is a good pick though. The only one I personally don't like is the Paladin, because he doesn't really excel in any area in particular. But that doesn't mean he's a shit pick or makes the game way harder than it needs to be. In fact, alongside the Knight, I think he's probably a pretty good pick if it's your first time playing King's Bounty. I do think it's a bad idea to run the Sorceress for the first time you play the game, but that's mainly because she has a hard time at the start of the game when you're still familiarizing yourself with the game's mechanics. By the mid-game, her magic abilities can be absolutely devastating on enemies, and it really makes some barriers in the game disappear. But this doesn't mean that the Knight or Barbarian are only powerhouses at the start of the game. Their strengths still hold relevance all the way to the end of the game, so the hero you pick at the start really goes down to how you actually want to play King's Bounty, and not about who scales better at certain points, which is honestly a problem that a lot of RPGs had around the time. I mean, to put it simply, can you not be bothered tracking spells and just want to brute force through everything with a massive army? Well, the Knight and Barbarian have you covered there. Or do you want to see how you can exploit magic and become an unstoppable force with a bit of planning? Sorceress is an easy choice, but the Paladin is also pretty capable of achieving that goal without having a rough time at the start of the game. But speaking of starting the game, once you've selected your hero, you are thrown right into it. I still have one more thing to mention before we actually get into the gameplay, and that's the many versions of King's Bounty. Like any game that came out in the 80s or early 90s, you have a whole heap of versions to play on different systems. When it came out in 1990, you could play it on the Commodore 64, Amiga, Mac, Apple II, and DOS. For the most part, all versions play the same, and you're not really missing out on anything from a purely gameplay perspective, but the overall presentation does shift a lot from each version. In 1991, a port of the game came out for the Sega MegaDrive, also known as the Genesis, which had some gameplay differences, but we'll get into that later in the video. Also worth noting is a port for the FM Towns and PC-98, which came out in 1994 in Japan. I would say these are the best versions of King's Bounty, improving the visuals and adding in some much needed audio, with some kick-ass tunes from Takeshi Abo. And look, some of these tracks sound like they've just come straight from an RPG on the Super Nintendo. They're much better than what you get in the original base game, which has no music at all. In fact, it has pretty much no audio at all, apart from when you pick up an item. That being said though, if you don't understand Japanese, you're gonna have a rough time with the FM Towns port. I mean, if you've played enough King's Bounty, the language barrier probably won't even be that much of an issue, but it's still gonna make things a lot harder. If you were to go play King's Bounty though, the DOS version would be my first recommendation. It's easy to get running just by dropping it on DOSBox or DOSBox X, and you're not going to have as many of the load issues that you might get with some of the other emulation methods. You can also play King's Bounty on your browser if you really want to. It still kind of impresses me that this is just like a thing you can do these days, so if you can't be bothered installing anything on your computer and just want to give it a go, it's definitely worth checking it out playing it that way. But like I said before, I'm sticking to the DOS version. I'm just really a sucker for DOS. So pretty much all the footage you're going to see in this video will be from the DOS version. Alright, now let's finally actually get into the game. It's been quite a long time since I last played this game, but I decided to run with the Sorceress this time around, because I usually don't see how much damage that magic spells actually do at the end of the game. You start off right in front of King Maximus's castle in the lands of Continentia, which sounds like the name of a deli that sells dope-ass sandwiches. This place is essentially your home base, so you'll be coming back here frequently. Your starting army is small and just isn't going to cut it for very long, so one of the first things you're going to want to do is recruit new troops from the castle. Fortunately, you can always come back here to recruit as many troops as you need, as long as you have the gold. You do start with a decent amount of gold, but it isn't enough to really get the ball rolling. But as mentioned before, you will get a commission from the king each week, which gives you a set amount of gold. From here, you're free to complete your quest in whichever way you'd like. The only thing that matters about your quest is that you recover the Scepter of Order from wherever it has been hidden. Hunting down villains, capturing castles, and searching for artifacts of great power are all purely optional objectives. However, that being said, each one of the villains does hold a piece of the map showing the exact location of the scepter. The artifacts scattered across the lands also each contain a piece of the map, making them all worth searching for. But whatever you decide to do, just don't waste too much time doing it. You are on a strict time limit, and if you don't find the Scepter of Order before time runs out, King Maximus will die, leaving the throne empty to be usurped by the Demon King, and then it's game over. Now obviously the fastest way to find the scepter is to gather the map pieces from the villains and artifacts, but you're going to need to find out where they're lurking first. You can quickly gain a contract to hunt a villain down from any town you come across. Doesn't matter which town you go to, the villains you go after will always be in the same order, but you won't know which castle they're in, or what armies they have defending them until you gather the correct information from the town closest to their castle. And that's without mentioning that right at the start of the game, their forces easily outmatch yours right now, so your best bet is to go explore the overworld for riches to help build up your army, and find out where you can recruit troops that are unavailable from King Maximus's castle. The amount of days you have is directly tied to what difficulty you chose at the start of the game. It is worth noting that your opponents aren't any smarter or more difficulty on higher difficulty settings. Also, RNG elements, like loot and creatures that you can hire, don't seem to be impacted either, so don't feel bad for picking easy just because you hate being on a time crunch. While I'm playing on normal here, I do prefer playing easy where I can just mess around a little bit more and don't have to optimize any of the paths that I take getting anywhere. Anyway, one day will pass every 40 squares you move, unless you decide to delve into the desert, where one tile is one whole day. This will just eat into how many days you have left incredibly quickly if you decide to go into the desert for too long. So when going into desert areas, you really want to make sure you're not going to be stuck into them for too long. Each week in King's Bounty is only 5 days long, because this kingdom is all business, baby, and we don't have time for weekends. Thankfully, this makes it very easy to track when the week is going to tick over, which is something you really do need to pay attention to. Because at the start of each week, King Maximus will give you whatever your commission is at the time, and you will instantly use a chunk of it to pay up whatever fees you have due at the moment, which is pretty much just going to be your troops upkeep and your boat rental. If you don't have enough gold to pay your troops, they just flat out leave your army, and you'll never get them back again. Also, at the start of each week, it will say it's a week of a certain unit, which is important to know if you need certain troops, but I'll get into that shortly. First, let's just appreciate this old school UI that we have on the right here. I love that you have this short animation of whatever villain you're hunting just on loot constantly. Same with the catapult right underneath it, showing that you have a siege weapon. You're going to have a siege weapon 90% of the game, and they really don't have to remind you about it, but I'm happy it's there. Same with the pentagram that lights up when you have the ability to cast magic. There's no way that I'm aware of where you can actually lose the ability to cast magic once you've learned it. I guess they just felt like they had to put something here, and they couldn't think of anything else. Underneath the pentagram you have a map of your progress, which is actually kind of helpful. You can bring up a bigger version of it at any time, which shows a real action shot of all the villains and artifacts still out there waiting for you to show up. Jeez, I wonder which part of the map the scepter is gonna be. Finally, you have your money represented by different coins. It's not the best at telling you how much money you really have, but a quick glance will see if you can spend a whole lot of money on new troops, or alternatively, quickly realize you're hell povo and better find some gold before the week ends so you can pay your army. While exploring, it won't be long until you encounter some hostile enemies. They will chase you around, but you won't be forced to fight them unless they manage to corner you. Engaging in combat switches from the overworld map view to the combat screen, where your army clashes with Arich's minions. Combat in King's Bounty is easy to figure out and fun to play. It's a turn-based system where each side has up to 5 different units that they move on a grid. Each unit has a number representing how many of that specific unit they control, like my 10 pikemen here, doing a little jig. Each one of these pikemen has 10 hit points and deal 2 to 4 damage each, so when they attack as a stack, they will deal between 20 and 40 damage. For every 10 damage they take, however, they will lose a stack, which will lower their damage on their next hit. So I know what you're thinking now. Why don't you just have one huge stack of the strongest unit you can get to just steamroll everything that comes into contact with it? And that's a solid plan. But in King's Bounty, you're like a new manager rocking up to a highly demoralized workforce. They don't really like you, but they will put up with you. But if you let too many of them band together in a big enough group, you're going to have to deal with any manager's worst nightmare. Your underlings unionizing. And if you let them do that, they go out of control and attack whatever is closest to them, regardless of if they're friend or foe. How many troops you can have at one time is determined by your leadership score, and it's a pretty easy system to understand. Basically, as long as your leadership score is higher than that group of units' HP, they're going to stay in line and do their job. Fortunately, your leadership affects each unit type individually, so you don't have to worry about taking less archers or knights because you have too many pikemen. Added to that, when recruiting units, the game does tell you what the maximum amount that you can control is, so you don't have to pull out a calculator each time you go to reinforce your army. With that last point, leadership may not seem like much of a thing to worry about, and really, it isn't. Until you forget that's a system that's in the game, and you get some extra troops from other methods that don't warn you about your limits. Sometimes wandering enemies may want to join your army, but the game isn't going to warn you that you can't keep them under control. So the next time you get into combat, you might be surprised when the units you just picked up turn around and just smack your archers in the face. But your leadership isn't locked in place at the start of the game. Capturing enough villains will gain you promotions, which are essentially level ups in King's Bounty. These promotions grant a huge boost to your leadership, more gold at the start of each week, and improvement to your hero's magic capabilities. Your first promotion will also gain you access to the cavalry unit from King Maximus, and your second promotion will gain you the knight unit from his castle. These are both incredibly strong units that you'll probably use right up until the end of the game. But gaining a promotion isn't the only way you can increase your leadership. You will come across gold pickups on the overworld, and when you find them you can either take the gold for yourself or distribute it amongst the peasants, and doing that second option gives you a nice little boost to your leadership. At the start of the game you won't gain much leadership from it, but it does add up pretty quick, and honestly I almost never took the gold every time I found one of these chests. There is also a raise leadership spell, increasing the leadership for 1 week, but if you're relying on this, you need to constantly refresh it. First time I had issues with troops going out of control was because of Ray's leadership actually. I completely forgot that I had it active when I went to recruit new units from the castle. I didn't even think for a second about why I could suddenly recruit a metric fuckton of knights, archers and pikemen that early in the game. And then I got into combat with a small group and those three just fucking decimated my cavalry and elves. And losing those elves was a real kick in the teeth because you can't just go back to the castle and recruit them. Non-castle units like elves can only be recruited on the overworld at a dwelling that is randomly generated at the start of the game. That's if their corresponding dwelling is actually spawned on your map. There is a chance that you might not actually be able to recruit some units because their dwellings don't even spawn in your playthrough. But even if you do find a dwelling that has units that you want, you can't rely on it too much. The number of troops you can recruit from it is limited by how many are actually there. So if you recruit every druid from this treehouse, and you probably will, the only way for that number to replenish is when the week ticks over to the week of the druid. What week it is completely random, and truthfully, I don't mind this system, but I do have one huge problem with it. It can be the week of any of the castle units, which you hire from King Maximus. There isn't a limit on how many castle units you can hire, their population is infinite. So it really just feels like a wasted week that you can't take advantage of. I felt like in this playthrough, I was constantly just hitting either week of the random castle unit or week of the peasant, so most of the dwellings were just empty for such a long time. And look, peasants are just fucking useless, so I was pretty much just forced to use castle units simply because there wasn't anything else to get. However, I do like that the system does push you to use different types of units that you might not normally take, even if they don't fight well together. The dwellings aren't the only things randomly generated in the game though. The scepter's location is randomized every time you start a new game, alongside with every treasure, roaming enemy, and villain location. The landscape of each of the continents does stay the same every game though, including all the castle and town locations, so you won't be entirely in the dark each time you start a new game. Towns not only give you contracts and info on villains, they each also have a spell available that is randomly selected when you start the game for the first time. Spells in King's Bounty are like single-use scrolls, so when you turn up to a town for the first time, it's always a good idea to note what spell they're actually selling, especially if it's a really helpful spell like Freeze, because it might be the only place you can buy it. Castles may not seem as important as towns, but they do act like the game's boss fights. The majority of them won't have a villain inside of them, instead just a random group of monsters occupying them, but if you clear them out and garrison some troops in there, you'll get a bonus to your weekly gold commission for each castle you occupy. So you do have some incentive to take them, but your main focus is going to be on the castles that the game's many villains occupy. If you have a contract for a villain like Murray the Miser here, and you know where he's lurking, it's time to go capture him for his crimes. The villains are essentially just tough fights, and the castle battles are a bit more cramped, so units with low movement can be much more effective here. If you manage to defeat the villain, you will gain a piece of their map, a decent chunk of gold for winning, and then even more gold for fulfilling the contract. You can attack villains without a contract, but if you win, they just relocate to another castle and you'll just have to fight him again. But as mentioned before, once you start taking out certain amounts of villains, you'll be promoted by the king. You can be promoted 3 times, and each class gets their promotions at different stages. The Barbarian, for example, hits the highest rank after capturing only 10 villains, as opposed to the Knight who needs to capture 14. And believe me, those extra 4 at a lower rank really does make things a lot harder. In the first area of the game, Continentia, you have 6 villains hiding away. I'd say none of them are really noteworthy, and they're all pretty easy, but I gotta mention Princess Amola, just because the game goes out of the way to say that she's fat and ugly. She's probably a bitch as well. None of the villains in Continentia are really going to be that difficult to fight once you build up your army, apart from maybe Canagor the Mystic. I went in way too unprepared, and even looking back at the footage, I'm surprised I didn't lose this first siege. He has 8 Archmages, as well as Knights, which are just unavailable for you at the time. So basically you just need some really strong numbers to take him down. There isn't anything stopping you from going to the next area, Forestia, and building yourself up a bit more before taking him on, unless you still haven't managed to find the map to go there. But you don't have to do that, you can take him out just using the resources you will find in Continentia. There isn't a huge punishment for losing. If you do, obviously you lose your army, which really sucks, but aside from that you just get sent back to the King's Castle and get a light scolding. After you take out Canagor, the game will give you contracts that direct you to Forestia, the second zone, and this is where the game starts giving you more challenging battles. To add on to that, once you hit Forestia, you can't easily just go back to the castle and restock up on troops when you lose them. It takes a week to travel between continents, so constantly going back to Continentia to replace small losses isn't the best idea, you'll just run out of time. But by now you should be familiar with the combat and how to position an attack to minimize losses. Also, it becomes pretty obvious about how limited the enemy AI is, so you can just exploit it if things get dire. The AI essentially just attacks the weakest target that they're next to, but it also means you can just put any tough unit next to them and they won't move to go for a target they can actually kill. They'll just beat on them until either you move them away or a weaker unit gets into their attack range. This means your ranged units are incredibly easy to defend, and ranged units that are able to just attack without retaliation are devastating to anything. Even when the AI has flying units, they're smart enough to fly them next to your ranged units at the start of combat, but if they end up landing next to a unit that has less HP per stack than the ranged one, then they'll attack them instead, often taking more damage in retaliation anyway. Also, you can just move your ranged units one step away, and as long as there is a unit next to that flyer, they'll just stay put and won't block your archers again. While the Wandering Monsters in Forestia are a bit stronger than Continentia, there's only 4 villains here that you need to worry about. They all are stronger than Canagor the Mystic, but you'll be hitting your second promotion in Forestia, and you'll gain access to Knights, which are just absolute powerhouses, and they'll make it a lot easier to deal with any of the villains. It was actually here where I fucked up with the Raised Leadership spell and accidentally got too many Knights. They actually took me out. And this is where I realized that if you lose to out of control units, they become wandering enemies. There is no way I'm fighting these guys again. Well, this is also where I started seeing the value of picking the Sorceress. In this fight against the villain Prince Barrowpine, I take out 11 Archmages with only 1 Fireball. My spell power isn't even close to being maxed out here either. I still have a promotion and an artifact that are going to buff it even more. But the only villain here that's really going to give you any trouble is Ronaldus Drybone. This guy has demons, and they are always a huge threat no matter how strong your army is. They have a chance on hit to just half the stack of units instead of only killing a few. It is a very low chance, but it's always there. They can also fly, so you need to take them out fast without being too careless with letting them halve your strong unit stacks. On top of that, Ronaldus has a lot of ghosts, which gain numbers with each unit they kill, so if you let them just kill stuff, they scale way out of control. Obviously, the villains don't have to deal with leadership problems, so their ghosts can scale infinitely. You can get ghosts yourself, but that's probably not a risk you want to take. After Ronaldus, you'll be going off to Archipelia, the 3rd zone in the game. This is where the game actually really throws challenging fights at you without going too crazy on the difficulty. It's honestly my favourite part of King's Bounty, where wandering monsters pose enough of a threat where you actually consider avoiding them, but they probably won't be sending you back to the king if you do engage with them. With that being said though, the villains here do require you to be prepared, and it's likely here that your army will start costing more than you earn, just so you can take those villains on. So in Archipelia, you really can't be wasting too much time when you're targeting those villains. There are another 4 villains here, but the most notable one is the second one, Mark Bellowspeak. This is where you're probably most likely going to encounter dragons for the first time, and they are tough. Their raw stats are just miles ahead of every other unit in the game. They can obviously fly being dragons, but most importantly, they are immune to all magic, so you have to try brute force them down while they just take chunks out of your army. This siege got close, but I was able to kite his ogres at the end with my elves. Idiots. After taking out all the villains here and grabbing the artifacts, you'll probably know where the scepter is. I know I definitely did, but I still have a lot of days left. Not to mention there's still 3 more villains to fight, and they're all in the last continent, which I haven't even been to yet. The last zone is Saharia, and this is a part of King's Bounty where the game just says hurry up and find the scepter already. Pretty much everything in Saharia is located inside a maze-like central area that is surrounded by desert tiles, so your time just drains away quickly exploring the place. Add on to that, the wandering monsters here are damn strong, often having giants, dragons and demons that can actually take huge chunks out of your army, even defeat you. But it's also here where you can hire those same high tier units to your army, and you'll also find out that if your army consists of only flying units, you can mount up and just fly over everything. Wandering monsters can't attack you when you're in the air, and desert tiles won't take a whole day to go through when you pass over them. Flying is actually so strong that rushing to Saharia as soon as you possibly can to get one flying unit to trivialize exploration in the other regions is probably the best strategy for beating the game quickly. So pretty much as soon as I got a flying unit, I just flew around Saharia and picked up absolutely everything on the map and figured out where all the high tier units spawn. I should also mention that I'm using the time stop spell as the sorceress here, which just gives me free extra time to do whatever I want. I might not be getting my weekly commission, but I'm also not paying my troops. And add on to that, none of the wandering enemies are actually wandering around anymore, so I can easily just go around everything. There's only 3 contracts here, and our first one is Magus Deathspell, the mage who summoned the Demon King Earthrax Killspite into our realm to replace the king. He has a pretty formidable army, but I get lucky and cut his archmages in half with my demons, and take down everything but his peasants. This amount of peasants would actually be a threat, but they can't really do any damage to dragons or demons, no matter how many there are. After Deathspell is Earthrax Killspite himself, the Demon King, and this arsehole is tough. He has a ton of knights alongside archmages, which you really just need to make sure don't get off their fireballs. That's before even thinking about his dragons and demons that can easily take your troops out. I actually lost to this guy the first time I went up against him, but fortunately, whatever troops you kill in a failed siege stay dead, so we can just whittle him down until his troops are nothing. Finally now, we are at the last villain, Dragon Breath himself, the mastermind behind the whole scheme to steal the scepter and install Earthrax onto the throne. How you meant to actually beat this guy normally? I have no idea. He has so many dragons that it will take so many weeks to constantly siege him and wear his forces down. I did see a method where you spam the Instant Army spell and Raise Leadership spell just to get an unstoppable force, but when I tried to do it and bought a whole bunch of Instant Army spells, it turned out that there was no way to actually buy the Raise Leadership spell. Oh well, I guess I'll finally go get the Scepter of Order and win the game then. Classic old game fashion, we get a very short clip of us winning, followed by a text congratulating us on beating the game before throwing us right out to DOS. But that's King's Bounty. It is fun to go through it again on higher difficulties because of how much of the game is randomized, but it's not as deep as a lot of RPGs coming out at the time, not even as deep as New World Computing's other games. But it is such an easy game to just jump in and play. I had an absolute blast playing through it again for the first time in a long time, but unfortunately the game didn't actually do too well. While I couldn't find any exact sales figures, John Van Caneghem has mentioned in various interviews that the game didn't sell too well, but that didn't stop them from releasing a Sega Mega Drive port a year later in 1991, which was published by Electronic Arts. The Mega Drive port at its core is a pretty solid one, but does do some things differently. Most notably the presentation, which I would say is a step up from the PC versions. The Mega Drive version's overworld isn't locked to a grid, so the camera scrolls around as you move around freely. Side-scrolling graphics like this wasn't really considered a technically viable thing for PCs to do when the PC versions came out, so it's nice that they took advantage of the Mega Drive's capabilities where they could. I also like how the peasants look in this version, wearing cool shades, and looking like some sort of medieval yobbo trying to start a fight for no reason.
Oi, just give us a fucking $1 for the bus, mate.
You also get some sound and music in the Mega Drive port. However, the sound effects are still pretty non-existent, and the soundtrack is, lacking. It's not the worst I've ever heard, but man, I wouldn't really call it that good. There's only a few tracks and you're pretty much going to be ping-ponging from the single overworld track to the town song and then finally the battle theme, and honestly I just wanted to mute the game after an hour. But there are also some pretty significant gameplay changes here as well. Enemies wandering around the map actually actively chase you down now. You don't have a choice to engage in combat once they reach you either. You're forced into it. Fortunately, the strongest unit in the group of enemies is what you'll see chasing you on the overworld, so you can sort of gauge whether you want to fight them or not before they actually get to you. It does make the game a little bit harder, especially since the wandering encounters seem to be a bit tougher than the PC versions. I was fighting much stronger units a lot earlier than my PC playthroughs, and they actually like to target your stronger units this time around as well, so you're more likely to lose some more valuable units if you're not careful. But that's not the only gameplay difference here. The desert tiles in the Mega Drive version just kind of slow you down a little bit instead of passing the days really quickly, so there aren't much of an obstacle that you need to worry about anymore. In fact, they almost act as a safe haven for you because enemies won't move into them. It definitely makes Sahari a much easier zone to travel around. But aside from those differences, it's pretty much the same game. There's nothing extra and nothing really significant missing, so it's a good port overall in my opinion. And there's definitely a lot of people who have pretty fond memories of playing this version when they were young, so it's definitely worth checking out. Unfortunately though, much like the PC versions, the Mega Drive port underperformed sales-wise as well. It doesn't look like King's Bounty was a total flop and lost a lot of money or anything, but it was a struggle for New World Computing to generate hype around it. And in the book, The Minds Behind the Games by Patrick Hickey Jr., John Van Caneghem mentions about how hard it was to get retailers to give it any decent shelf space. Keep in mind, New World Computing was still 100% independent at this stage, and were publishing the games that they developed. They had only released 2 really noteworthy games at that point, and they were both Might and Magic games. It's pretty easy to imagine retailers being hesitant to stock a new IP from them and take away space from bigger studios with large publishers attached to them. But hey, even with all that, the game wasn't a complete failure. The reviews are actually pretty good, and New World Computing was getting a lot of really positive feedback from the gamers that did buy King's Bounty. Even well after its release, they were getting letters asking if they were going to do a sequel to it while they were working on new Might and Magic games. But it was one person in particular who really loved King's Bounty that was able to make John seriously consider making a follow-up. It was his wife, Michaela. In a 2004 interview with Celestial Heavens, which is a fan site for everything Might and Magic, John recounted that every day, Michaela would ask him, "When are you going to make a sequel to King's Bounty? That's the best game. That's better than Might and Magic. and that's the one they make a sequel for. Eventually, he gave in. It is worth mentioning that Michaela was pretty instrumental in the founding of New World Computing, and did help out a lot with making the early Might and Magic games, so her words did hold some weight to him. Eventually, John gave in and started working on a sequel. And that sequel ended up turning into Heroes of Might and Magic, a strategic quest, which became its own beast entirely. That game is a story for another time, but while on the subject of Heroes of Might and Magic 1, the Windows version did come packaged with a copy of King's Bounty. But that's not the end of King's Bounty, because I still have one more game to talk about, and it intertwines King's Bounty with Heroes of Might and Magic even more. Jump forward to the year 1999. New World Computing is running on a high after releasing Heroes of Might and Magic 3 to critical acclaim, and is flying off store shelves on its release. One of the things that made Heroes so popular was its hot seat multiplayer mode, which let you play with your friends offline on the same computer. If you didn't have a Heroes game, you probably knew someone who did, and if you were around at the time, you probably have good memories of playing one of the Heroes games at someone else's house and getting hooked on it, even if you weren't a PC gamer. This meant that there was a demand for a console version of a Heroes game slowly rising, and New World Computer's parent company, 3DO, notices that there are a bunch of console gamers waiting to get into that Heroes action. Unfortunately, this is the point in 3DO's history where they're going through some pretty extreme financial difficulties and are quickly falling apart. So naturally, they got New World Computing to slap together a Heroes game for the PlayStation 2 with a minimal budget and not a lot of time, and the result was 2001's Heroes of Might and Magic: Quest for the Dragonbone Staff, released on April 17 in North America.
You want to know about dragons? You fancy yourself a dragon slayer? You! What do you suppose a dragon to be? A dog at your feet? A mere beast? Even the lowliest of dragon commands the highest respect from mortal men, and you plan the demise of the great dragon Malazek. I too was once blinded by this ambition. Sent great men to their deaths, no hope for glory. Do you think that because Argus is your king that your revenge is honorable? You'll need more than a quick sword and a vengeful heart. You'll need that thing forged from the very essence of the greatest of all dragons. The great sunworm mother, who willed her own great heart to stop beating, had her bones cast at the feet of the great elven wizard Yartooth, whose magic bound her bones to the wood of the ancient first tree. Birthing to the universe that most terrible instrument of life and death, you'll need the Dragonbone Staff.
And here's where it all comes back full circle to King's Bounty. Quest for the Dragonbone Staff is King's Bounty. It's not like King's Bounty, it straight up is just a remake of the MegaDrive version. But there are some differences that make it worth having a quick look at. Firstly, the story has changed. The quest is obviously for the Dragonbone Staff instead of the Scepter of Order. Staff is the only weapon capable of killing the antagonist, Malazak, a dragon who, much like Arich, is planning to conquer the kingdom that we are a part of. He has succeeded in poisoning the king and is waiting for him to die a slow painful death, which gives us our time limit on finding the staff. But now the king is in a coma and out of action, so we the hero answer to the queen while we journey on our quest. Aside from the story, the whole presentation gets an update. It's worth noting that this is technically the first Might and Magic game that is entirely in 3D. Unfortunately, that low budget does really shine through here though. Even for an early PS2 game, its graphics aren't anything to write home about. I mean, just look at this attack animation on the orc. I guess animating the bow and arrow on him was going to dig into the budget a little too much. The combat portion of the game is kind of reworked visually to show off these high quality models and animations as well. Now instead of just selecting where you want your units to go, you walk them around and actually get some animations of them attacking and defending, which is nice, but it does feel a little bit clunky. Also, you can sometimes move your units further than they should be able to if they're blocked by something. It's small things like this that really show they were rushing to get this game out. On the upside of the presentation, we do get a soundtrack that was composed by the legendary Paul Romero, Rob King, and Steve Vucker. It's a great soundtrack that really gets you in the fantasy adventure mindset. There are a few tracks that are just taken from Heroes 3, but honestly, they are great songs and I'm not going to complain about having to hear them in another Heroes game. Even if the game isn't really a Heroes game, it's good to see at least got some amazing music that the rest of the series experienced. There have been some tweaks to the gameplay as well. For starters, wandering monsters are far less aggressive at pursuing you over the Genesis version, which is nice. And you now know how much buying a large stack of units is actually going to cost when you buy them, instead of having to pull out a calculator. You can also select what contract you want to take. I didn't actually realize this at first until I picked out my second contract and went to fight him, only to realize that this meant I was doing the hardest fight in the first zone, and I'm taking it on way too early. You may wonder why you would want to take harder contracts, but it can be helpful to miss some villains if you don't want to risk going up against demons or something. But that's where the quality of life improvements end. Like I mentioned before, the combat does feel a bit clunky, but that's not the only thing that's been changed. Archmages and druids can now do their range attacks even if they have an enemy in melee next to them, so you can pretty much just guarantee that you're losing some of your ranged units if you're up against some of them. The combat in the game did seem a bit harder in my one playthrough I did, throwing dragons into a random combat encounter way too early. The wandering monster here should have been a goddamn dragon and not a fucking dwarf. What the hell? Also, while the UI might not be as hectic as the original, it would be nice to just have the days left counter always there instead of only showing up when a day passes. But the biggest change made in Quest for the Dragonbone staff is in the actual quest itself. Now you actually have to beat the final villain. I'll be honest, I was pretty over playing King's Bounty at this point, so I decided I was just going to dig up the staff and get the ending, so I could put it in this video. It was only then that I realized that getting the staff doesn't end the game like it does in the original King's Bounty. I actually have to go beat Malazak, and that is no easy task because he is the same as Arich. Luckily I still had a whole lot of days left, as well as a ton of gold, so I just threw my army at him to weaken him slowly. I did try to cheese it a little bit by attacking him with one demon at a time to try and halve his dragon stacks, but I never got a proc, and it was incredibly boring. So I just kept passing weeks until I had a big enough army to put dents into his insane amount of dragons and demons, until I could finally beat him and get the ending to the game. And with that, let's see how the ending actually is.
Children will forever sing songs about the young hero who defeated Malazak the dragon, and thus delivered the Dragonbone staff back into the deft hands of King Argus. As the king's favorite, you will no doubt be called upon again to test your courage, your wit, and your mettle. But as for today, let me buy you a tankard of ale.
You know what? I could go for a tankard of ale after that. There isn't really much else to say about Quest for the Dragonbone staff. I'm sure there's plenty of folks out there that have fond memories of this game back when it came out, but honestly, I do feel like it's one of the weaker ways to play King's Bounty. It is amusing to see that the game that led to the Heroes franchise ended up becoming part of it, but I have to say, if I was a PS2 gamer back in the day, hyped to finally get a Heroes of Might and Magic game for myself after seeing the PC games at a friend's house, I would have been pretty disappointed with getting this. The game was never marketed as a King's Bounty remake, so I can't help but feel like the whole thing was a bit deceptive. Look, it's not a bad game or anything, it's just as great as the other versions of King's Bounty, but Heroes and King's Bounty aren't the same, even if they are linked to each other. Looking back at Quest for the Dragonbone staff, I think it's pretty obvious that this was just something 3DO wanted to throw out just to hopefully make a quick buck when things started getting tight. And hell, it's not the worst product they pushed out onto the marketplace when things were tough. No, it definitely wasn't. So it's at least worth mentioning that. That's it for King's Bounty from New World Computing though. After 3DO killed New World Computing and went bankrupt though, a Russian game publisher, 1C Company, managed to snag the rights to King's Bounty in 2007, and they got a small developer called Kotori Interactive to work on a new King's Bounty game. They released King's Bounty: The Legend in 2008, and it was received pretty well. They made a bunch of follow-up games that are also well rated, but this video isn't about them, and I didn't play them to be honest, so whatever, that's all I have to say about them here. But there was also an unofficial fan sequel for the original being developed by a Ukrainian guy in the 90s. But he did abandon the project after completing the first half of the game. You can play what he made, but it's all in Russian or Ukrainian, so Good luck figuring out what the hell is actually going on here. Hell, I can hardly comprehend English, and that's my native tongue, so I've got no chance here. Overall, King's Bounty deserves to get a bit more recognition for its impact on gaming. A strategic side project from an RPG developer that ended up laying the groundwork for one of the most beloved PC franchises of the 90s. Its unique, simple and addicting gameplay certainly made it worth getting back when it came out, but unfortunately it just wasn't enough to get noticed by a wider audience, leading to its ideas being put on the backbench for years. Its legacy will always be tied to the Hero series, but it does deserve to be more than just a footnote of that game's story. Although they do share a lot of similarities, King's Bounty does play a lot differently, and it is definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of those type of games, even if it is just to see the roots of the gameplay. It's pretty easy to find and download if you're interested in playing it. Hell, like I mentioned before, some websites let you play it through straight up sorcery, I guess, so it's definitely worth checking out if you've got some time. My first playthrough took me about 5 hours from start to finish, so you can sink a decent amount of time into it. But that's all for this one. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because there is more to come. Otherwise, take it easy.